Shakila ma'am was the OSD for 14 years in MHRD for new Education Policy 2020, which popularly known as NEP 2020, Department of Education, Ministry of Education, India. She was nodal officer of flagship program of Government of India, NMTT, which is later popularly known as Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya National Mission for Teachers Training, PMMMNTT. Similarly, ma'am has launched in 12th plan various other faculty induction program like CALM, that is Center for Academic Leadership and Educational Management. Next one is Leadership Academic Program, LEAP, and Annual Refresher Program for Teaching, that is ARPIT. These were the flagship program of the Government of India, Ministry of Education. Participant, in a very brief, I'm not going into detail. Participant Shakila ma'am is the beautiful combination of academic caliber as well as administrative expert. I don't have any hesitation to mention over here that ma'am has the authority on all the aspect and dimension of NEP 2020. With these words, participant, I will also like to mention here that if you really wish to know much more about this NEP 2020, I think today's speaker, Dr. Shakila T. Shamsu ma'am, is the best one who can sort out your all it and buts and doubts in this session. That is, and she always prefer to have a talkative lecture with you, ma'am. To this session, the group of this group is also very active as far as discussion as you usual like. With these words, ma'am, I will invite to speak on a topic that is governance and management of higher education as envisaged in NEP 2020. Thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us. Now the mic over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Aftab. I just wanted to know how many days they are into this program.
Ma'am, today is the second day, second day.
Last day.
Okay.
Second last day, sorry. So they have had about, it's a 7-day program. It was a 7-day program.
8 days.
Okay. So as usual, thank you all for joining for the session, and I'm sure you've been benefiting from many of the sensitization sessions that has been held so far. But I'm very keen, before I really talk about governance and management, and to some extent cover even leadership, which is a part of it, I would really like to hear from you, maybe a couple of you all till 4 o'clock maybe, where I would like to hear from you all your own experiences in implementing the national education policy, and maybe some concerns or some views that you would like to share with me. I would prefer to do that rather than jumping into the topic directly. So may I invite the participants to unmute themselves, introduce themselves from their discipline, their institutional affiliation, and share their thoughts with me on the national education policy.
Ma'am,
good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
I'm Dr. Mohan Kumar. I'm from Karnataka. I'm from St. Joseph's University, Bangalore. In fact, we have implemented NEP 2020 3 years back. I think we were the first state to implement the NEP 2020.
Right.
We initially had a fruitful experiences, madam, and the students are very much interested in opting the courses offered under NEP 2020. Since I come from the science background and science faculty, some of the courses were not opted by the students. Say, for example, we have kept as a chemistry. Some of the students have not taken the chemistry as well. And in particularly in the biology sectors, and in fact microbiology, biotechnology, and molecular biology, zoology, we wanted to have chemistry. Chemistry is a very important, but some of the students have not taken the chemistry as a part of their learning. So this is what has happened even since last 3 years.
Okay.
But now we have a SCP, state education policy. So this year onwards we are there with the SCP. Of course, in future we may implement this NEP 2020. So this is what my experience now.
Okay. Just a comment on what you just mentioned, because even if you have the state education policy, I mean, most of the states implement the national policy either by modifying it to suit their own state requirements, or they sometimes would like to bring out their own state policy as a reflection of their own state aspirations. Now, whatever be the situation, an institution located in a given region has to follow whatever the state government's guidelines and directives keep coming out from time to time. However, I do think that the state policy that is there also tries to take forward the idea of multidisciplinarity and the imperatives of having more choices and flexibilities to the students, because that is the need of the hour. And I hope that that would be taken forward in that spirit. But to put your concern also in the aspect of students not choosing some subjects which are pure sciences, that is not really reflective of anything with the NEP, but it is more of a trend that we are seeing, that pure sciences do not seem to attract a lot of students unless it is specifically for a purpose of doing, let us say, a given kind of a course. Like up to class 12, they do it because they want to try for medicine or they want to try for engineering. But when it comes to the regular BSc or the regular bachelor's, which can be called as BA, BCom, BSc in a multidisciplinary format also, if you feel that chemistry as a subject has to be taught along with other subjects or has to be learned by the student, I think in the induction meetings, we must make students aware of it. Sometimes students are not aware. When you offer a whole range of courses, there is a feeling that let us avoid the courses which are sort of not liked by them. But you need to make them understand that you can understand a certain subject better if you learn this along with this particular subject. I think we have not seriously understood the advantages of conducting a very detailed student induction program, which I think is very, very essential, because for the first time, students are being given this freedom to make choices. And they have all come out from a baggage where decisions were taken not by them, but was taken by someone else. And that is where basically we are trying to make that shift happen. But therefore, an induction meeting where we not only invite students, but also parents who sometimes try to impose their views on students. We all double up in our roles as parents also. And we sometimes make choices for our students, not respecting the individual's abilities to maybe cope with a given subject. So I think it's a matter of greater awareness and advocacy that is needed so that students make correct choices. And I'm sure it must be only a transitional phase, and we will definitely have students for subjects like pure sciences, including chemistry, as we go forward. Any other observation, please? I can take 3 people before I go into my talk. Anyone else?
Ma'am, good evening, ma'am. This is Abdul Rahim.
Good evening.
I'm under Indian Maritime University.
Mm-hmm.
I teach in Tolani Maritime Institute, Pune.
Mm-hmm.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you are.
Ma'am, before coming to this NEP 2020, we laid a foundation in our college with the teaching and preparation of faculty. Faculty were made compulsion of at least completing 2 SWAYAM platform courses regarding their multidisciplinary things, ma'am. And later, last year onwards, students were more given emphasis on credit marking, where they were ought to do their uh, courses from SWAYAM platform, and their credit marks were also being taken care of.
Taken care.
Previously, people were told to do it, but regarding credit mark scoring, there was an ambiguity. From last year onwards, in ABC, this credit marks were shifted, and people are happy, and faculty is also happy because they want to expand their wings and in their own horizon. We are doing this, ma'am. We are doing it because I am from marine engineering. I have been focusing on hydraulics. I have been focusing on mechatronics. in pneumatic systems,
Mhm.
as well as management subjects,
Okay.
everything, ma'am. This was a platform which our college started from last 3 years onward,
Okay.
and fruitfully everything is in fact now. And whatever we have been doing it now, it is same thing is being reflected in NEP 2020, and more of the faculties are going into these programs, and we are happy, ma'am, that
Okay.
at least someone has acknowledged our efforts which we have put 3 years back.
Okay. No, so it is reflective of the fact that the Maritime University has taken cognizance of the changes that are needed today, where graduates are expected to not just know one specific specialization, but have a broad spectrum of skill sets and knowledge exposures, which is the background by which we brought about this idea of a very integrated, flexible, multidisciplinary undergraduate program. So happy to know that your institute, which is you in a very rare field that is there, and many people opting today, even full-fledged core engineering students opting for marine engineering, are being exposed to this kind of coverage, because otherwise they will be in a very small specialization or in a very niche specialization without getting a broader comprehensive view of other disciplines. So happy to know about this development. It is also a learning for me that the Maritime University has already been implementing a multidisciplinary approach. Okay, one more observation, if we can take the third and the final speaker before I jump into my talk.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
I'm Yasir Arfat, Assistant Professor, Indian Institute of Mass Communication.
Okay.
एक्चुअली हमारे यहाँ क्योंकि ये एक डीम्ड टू बी यूनिवर्सिटी का दर्जा जस्ट अभी कुछ महीने पहले ही मिला है, ये मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन ब्रॉडकास्टिंग के अंडर में आता है, तो यहाँ एनईपी अभी हम लागू करने के प्रोसेस में हैं। लेकिन जितना एनईपी को मैं समझता हूँ, क्योंकि मैं एक रिसर्च स्कॉलर भी हूँ सेंट्रल यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ हिमाचल प्रदेश में, तो ये मल्टी डिसिप्लिन, इसका एक लॉन्ग टर्म इम्पैक्ट अभी देखने को मिलेगा। इसका मेन पर्पस होलिस्टिक डेवलपमेंट है, जिसमें आपका स्टूडेंट को न केवल मतलब अपने फील्ड के लिए एक बेहतर तरीके से तैयार करना इसका उद्देश्य है, बल्कि इंस्टीट्यूट को इतना फ्लेक्सिबल भी बनाना है कि वो उसका जो मेन गोल है, जो हम जिस एजुकेशन सिस्टम की बात पहले से जो हमारे भारत में चलता रहा है, उस वहां पर लेकर जाना है, ताकि हम ओवरऑल होलिस्टिक डेवलपमेंट, चाहे वो उसका सोसाइटी के प्रति उसकी जो रोल है, रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है, वो भी फुलफिल करे और अपने कैरियर गोल को भी फोकस करे।
जी, ओके, थैंक यू फॉर शेयरिंग दैट। लेकिन आई जस्ट वांट टू टेल दैट द नीड टू बिकम flexible and to move towards multidisciplinarity is no longer a choice that we should have. It is almost imperative that we give that, because currently the separated silo-based degrees of arts, science, commerce, and pharmacy and technology and so on have started becoming counterproductive. By that I mean that these students, when industry tells us, or when there is a general observation that 40% of our graduates are unemployable, in some cases it is ranging, even as some would observe, up to 60% are unemployable. Not that they are unemployed. Unemployed is something you can tackle. But when you say that the students are not worthy of being employed, that they do not have the necessary kind of skill sets and knowledge exposures, it is a very dangerous observation. It's a very frightening observation, considering that India has the largest youth population. That number is a mind-boggling number, and then we cannot talk of India's demographic dividend. It will become a demographic disaster. So the world over, globally, we need to understand that silo-based degrees are becoming very obsolete. And though we are all products of silo-based degrees, it was appropriate at that point of time. But the circumstances that have now emerged, where we understand that knowledge is multidisciplinary, where we understand that learning is multidimensional, and where we are seeing the tremendous impact of disruptive technologies, we are looking at graduates who are not I-shaped graduates with only discipline specialization, but we are looking at graduates with T-shaped graduates, where you not only have specialization, but you also have a range of exposure of multiple disciplines and multiple skill sets. Therefore, for you, you can be rest assured, if you have any apprehensions, what would be the impact of multidisciplinary education, that this is the right approach that we have taken, because currently the existing graduates are showing a lot of unproductivities in their capabilities. Even engineers working as clerks are highly reflective of something that is systemically wrong in the way an engineering graduate is not capable of getting engineering jobs, but is working in a clerical position. So that correction that was needed and that rationalization that was needed was a very important reform, but it shakes many of us as teachers from our comfort zone for two reasons. One, because we started believing that the discipline I teach is more important than the discipline that my colleague teaches. And there is really no hierarchy of disciplines. All disciplines stand in their own right, and these disciplines are not in concrete blocks, but they are getting integrated with other disciplines, and therefore an integrative approach and a collaborative approach becomes important. Now, we lack collaborative skills. As individuals, we don't collaborate with our own colleagues. As departments, we do not collaborate. And as institutions also, we do not collaborate. In that context, multidisciplinarity becomes very difficult to implement. So the need, therefore, of a collaborative approach is again an attitudinal change that must come about within us as faculty, within institutions as higher education institutions, clustering together, collaborating together. Then only we can have a very global, contemporary, and futuristic way of looking at how higher education is being implemented. Until then, India will have this tragedy of having more than 1,000 universities, but less than 10 institutions coming in global rankings. If we have to change all that, then we must be able to embrace all these so-called almost transformative reforms that may not make us very comfortable, because we have to change the way we were approaching teaching learning. We have to use innovative pedagogies. We have to come forward and look at a very holistic approach and a more, I would say, a more flexible approach from our structured ways of looking at education. That is a difficult thing, because mindset changes are the most difficult to come about. But definitely the dividends of this kind of an approach is beneficial not only for the students, but for the institutions and for us as faculty to have more outcome-oriented education, rather than merely saying that I taught and assume that the student has learned, because you may have done your job of taking a class or a lecture, but did that student really benefit, and did that student really achieve the desired goal, is where we are trying to have a more, I would say, a more connected approach between teaching and learning, and not looking at it from a teacher's perspective, but looking at it from the learner's perspective. And therefore, a learner-directed approach with multidisciplinarity will definitely have more yielding returns as we go along. So thank you all for sharing your views and perspectives, and I'm happy to hear them. And let me now get into talking on this topic of governance and management in higher education as envisaged in the national education policy. And to some extent, it interweaves within itself the topic of academic leadership also. So as I mentioned, even in my observations to some of you all, that India has one of the largest higher education systems in the world. In terms of numbers, we are a mind-boggling as many as 1,068 universities, which can have easily crossed about 1,100 universities, about nearly 47 to 48,000 affiliated colleges, and about 13 to 14,000 standalone institutions, with about nearly 16 lakh faculty and something like about 44 million students. It's a huge number in terms of quantitative numbers. It's a very large landscape that we are looking at. But what is challenging, and what we felt when writing this policy also, is that our higher education is quantitatively large, but lacking in quality. And one of the major reasons that it lacks in quality is the very poor governance, leadership, and the way we regulate higher education. Now, having said that, it would be quite inadequate not to give you an idea about some of the challenges that Indian higher education systems face. One is that on one side, while we have the largest higher education system, our higher education system is a very complex system, in the sense that there are institutions which are managed directly, funded and controlled by the government of India, a large number of institutions that is in the state sector and where the bulk of the enrollment comes in. And then you have private universities, you have deemed universities, and so on. So the character of the higher education institutions are not uniform, and they are different in terms of their jurisdictional authorities, in terms of their governance, in terms of their funding, and all this adds to the complexity of how to govern higher education institutions. The second challenge that comes in is that as a system of higher education, though we may talk in terms of having these numbers quantitatively, we are having a lot of disparities in the degrees or in the levels at which we have participation from all cross sections of the society. Because higher education is an aspirational goal, and every student must aspire to get higher education. I am not getting into the debate of whether we should massify higher education or whether higher education should remain an elitist aspiration, because that's a different debate altogether. But as an aspiring Indian, we are all hoping that every educated person gets into the portals of a college or a university and completes a degree at the minimum level, and therefore that remains an aspirational goal. But India is very diverse, and we have people coming in from what we wrote in the policy as the socially and economically backward sections, that is the SEDGs, the socially and economically disadvantaged groups, which includes the SCs, the STs, the OBCs, minorities, linguistic and religious minorities, urban poor, girls, transgenders, people living in geographically inaccessible areas, and so on. The participation rate of people coming from these so-called marginalized sections seems to be much below the general average. And in a sustainable environment, or in terms of trying to achieve sustainable development goals, you know that the SDG goal 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education with lifelong learning opportunities for all. This is a huge challenge, because we want every cross section of the society to be able to have enabling opportunities by which they can participate in higher education. And therefore addressing regional and social disparities and ensuring that you look at equity and you look at quality at the same time and be inclusive by nature is again a challenge. Because when you look at the goals of NEP, you talk about access, you talk about equity, you talk about quality, accountability, and affordability. Many a times you may find that these conflict with one another. For example, the more you increase access and the more you address inclusion, you may sometimes find that quality may not come in. The second is when you try to increase quality, sometimes you find education as not being very affordable. And in the whole process, are we looking at very accountable structures that are there? Accountability of students, accountability of parents, accountability of the leadership, accountability of the government, accountability of stakeholders who are involved into education. So that is really a big challenge that we are looking at. And we tend to, as teachers and as faculty, not really look at these from a very, I would say, a very integrated manner. That comes in only when you get into policy planning and educational planning, that and try and understand that these are not supposed to be at conflict. They are supposed to be complementary, and you have to achieve these goals not as mutually exclusive, but together that we achieve all these goals together. The next challenge is where we've looked in higher education as the knowledge dissemination as being very theoretical by nature and not incorporating skills within it. So education and skills, there have been for a very long time, we ignored the importance of integrating education and skills together, which is now being looked at because we have an approach where skill enhancement and vocationalization are seen as part of the whole exercise that we are trying to do of giving students not just the theoretical knowledge, but also the experiential part of it, and putting skills as a very important factor that impacts their employability quotient and makes them well equipped to meet with the kind of jobs that may be coming about, or the kind of future jobs that may be coming about. So that the gap between education and skills was also a challenge. The next was our inability to really look at various models of learning or teaching and learning. So we thought that learning can happen only in a given face-to-face situation. We did not expand and make open and distance learning very qualitatively of a high order. And therefore, the need to make ODL systems also of high quality and get in quality assurance mechanisms is an important part. And using technology in a very, I would say, judicious manner for not only enhancing the teaching learning experiences, but also improving the quality of education by getting best people to talk in an online mode, using hybrid models and blended models of teaching learning. All this leading to the idea of virtual universities and online learning like Swayam. You had one of the participants mentioning that, and the massive open online courses of MOOCs, which are all trends that are globally happening, and India also cannot escape from those changes, and we need to move towards that. COVID, in a certain sense, accelerated us to move towards platforms like this, where we are doing things in an online mode, but many of us just got into it because we were not prepared for it. However, we just the requirements and necessity is the mother of invention, so we just jumped into it and started doing these kind of online teaching and so on. But the way and the rigor and the quality with which it needs to be done still is a long way ahead, and we are still going into that. The next challenge that we are looking at is the whole question of poor quality of education. And poor quality of education, for me, someone who has been in the ministry for so long and hearing how the government perspective is that the first person they're willing to blame for the poor quality of education is the teacher. And it takes a lot of effort to convince someone in the government sector that teachers are not the only reason who are responsible for poor quality of education. You have many reasons, because there is poor leadership, there is poor governance systems, there is lack of infrastructure, there are lack of the teaching learning resources are not there, training is not being provided to the teachers. There is an absolute lack of professionalism in the way we look at capacity building and so on of teachers. So the whole, I would say, a combination of various factors has resulted in this assumption, or rather a presumptive view, that the poor quality of higher education and only IITs or some brand names alone are sort of the owners of quality of education. Is something that we need to address, because you do have institutions at different levels of quality, and that is why the whole quality assurance frameworks of NAC and NIRF and so on have started coming into play, because quality assurance comes in through standard setting and accreditation norms and then getting into the ranking framework. So there is now an increasing awareness that instead of condemning that only 9 institutions feature in global rankings, how can India overcome that quality deficit that is there? And therefore, the need for very effective quality assurance mechanisms, and that higher education institutions must have an internal quality assurance cell, which looks at training, which looks at various other aspects that take care of quality, is becoming a growing reality. And that is another challenge that we're looking at. Then the funding and the external regulation is also one more factor. The regulation, that is, are Indian higher education institutions over-regulated? Do we have to deal with not only the UGC, but the AICT, the NCT? We have 17 such regulatory bodies, and that is what led us in the policy to look at regulatory reforms, which I will come to in a short while. So this, the idea of having a balance between autonomy and accountability and the regulatory mechanisms, trying to maintain this very delicate balance of giving HEIs a lot of internal governance freedom and autonomy, at the same time holding them accountable with using technology and using more standard operating protocols which are in public disclosure, and not asking them to do a lot of paperwork, comes in with minimal regulation, as we called it in the policy, the light but tight regulation, is another big challenge that we are looking at. And the last, I would say, not one among the last, but there could be many others, I'm only talking about the major ones, is the absence of adequate funding. So while centrally funded institutions like central universities and IITs and IIMs and ICERs and IIITs and NITs get major chunk of funding right from the government of India, state universities, which has about 94% of the entire enrollment in higher education, get very abysmally low funding from the UGC, which routes it through the state governments. And that is a major concern. So the low level of funding is in a way very much a factor that impacts the quality of education. And therefore, these are some of the, you must as an educator understand that these are some of the broad challenges that Indian higher education system is facing. There are a lot of strengths too. We have a lot of strengths in the sense of the size and the scale, and the fact that we have provided access to what we considered hitherto inaccessible areas, and we have provided, we look at equity, and we have tried to be more inclusive through scholarships and free ships for people coming from the marginalized sections. We are looking at learning disabilities, we are looking at children with physical disabilities, we are looking at many aspects of intervention by which there is greater participation. So there are strengths, there is no doubt about that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here where we are, where India is being recognized for education. But at the same time, these all factors directly bring us to the questions of how higher education institutions need to be governed internally as well as externally be regulated. And while talking about governance, we said that whether you are funded by the government of India, or whether you are a state government institution, whether you are a private institution, whether you are a deemed university, all of them must have very robust governing bodies. So we normally have apex body, which we call as the board of governors. In some cases it is being called the executive council, depending upon the nomenclature and the status of that institution or the character of that institution. We have different names being called, but largely it is the board of management or the board of governors, or it is called the executive committee. That remains an apex body. Then every institution has its own academic councils, it has its own finance committees. In some cases it has the court. In some cases you also have an executive committee, which is sometimes called a senate, or it's called an executive committee. So there are a multiple set of governance structures, internal governance structures that are there within each higher education institution. Can I request Shobha Kumari to mute herself? Okay, so going forward, we need to understand that internal governance structures must be very robust bodies which follow standard processes and not take decisions which are not based on rational frameworks. So what happens is, in bodies, in HEIs which are governed by the government of India, since there is a government representative and the funding is directly done by the government, usually processes are transparent. There is all the minutes are recorded and everyone is aware of decisions that are taken in a very democratic manner, where all the stakeholders who are represented on those bodies are making conscious decisions in a very consensus based decision making, and not a sense of, let us say, undemocratic or imposing a decision because of. So the government representative might in all probability in centrally funded and state governed universities only try to mention that this is doable and this is not doable, but would not necessarily impose a view unless they see that there is a blatant violation of standard norms, financial norms, or administrative statutes are not being followed. Otherwise, decisions are taken in a very democratic, discussed manner, and where views are invited, and then there is a consensus at which they arrive and form a resolution when taking such a decision. Now, that is a very important factor of having a governing body, whether it is an academic council, whether it is a finance committee, whether it's even the board of management or the board of governors or the executive committee or the Senate, wherever they are. These bodies should not in a certain way take unilateral decisions violating certain standard procedures and standard norms and rules and statutes that are being there for the university or for a college, as it may be. Now, in many of the private institutions and even deemed universities do not really face much of a problem, because deemed universities are by the UGC having someone who will take care of the, let us say, the norms and processes. The major fear that comes is in what we are seeing are purely private universities. Now, in our policy, we were very conscious of the fact that the role of the private sector cannot be ignored in education. And it is very short-sighted to say that the private sector has no role in higher education or in school education. The largest number of schools, colleges, higher education institutions in technical field, in professional field, in medical field, in even general education are now very much there from the private sector. So privatization is not equivalent to commercialization. This is the distinction we must understand. Everything that is private is not a commercialized venture. What is important is to see that the private institution also adheres to the standard operating protocols and follows the given norms and processes, which takes into factor the aspects of accountability. That is not only public accountability, but also accountability to the government to a certain extent, and accountability to the stakeholders, to the parents of the students, where the parents are paying fees may be much higher than other institutions, with this hope that that particular private institution is providing much better infrastructure and much better quality of teaching than maybe a government institution. It's a perception. I am not making a value judgment what is good and what is bad. I'm only trying to tell you that there has to be a sense of accountability. Now, in these private institutions, the bulk of them do follow standard norms and processes. But we are quite skeptical and quite suspicious of institutions which are run by family trusts and which are privately owned institutions where only family members start taking over the internal governance and they dominate the internal governance structures, be it the board of governors and so on. So we are conscious that these private institutions are subject to certain norms and processes, and they will not commercialize their activities, because we also laid down, and which is a Supreme Court directive, that education is a not-for-profit activity, and therefore it is a public service. And while these private institutions do not operate as charitable organizations, they are looking at profits and they are looking at revenue generation. Whatever revenue is earned has to go back into the educational development of that institution. So you cannot have any private institution which runs a college or a university making profits from whatever revenue they get from fees or from anything else, and then diverting it to, let us say, selling a textile or running a mall or anything else. You cannot have that. It has to get back into the institution. You construct a good lab, you construct a good incubation center, you set up a beautiful library. All this is possible. You provide better infrastructure, enhance the salaries of the teaching staff. All that is acceptable. But you cannot have the revenue going out of it and going into activities which are of a commercial nature. Now, this is important for us to understand, because we said that both public and private institutions will be governed by the same set of norms and regulations. Therefore, all the norms and regulations will uniformly apply to whether you are a government-funded institution, an aided institution, or a purely private institution. You are governed by the same set of norms and standards. So where the regulation comes in, where you have to offer programs, it should be as per the UGC nomenclature. If it is in technical education, it should be as per AICT regulations. If it is in teacher education, as per NCT. If it is law, by the Bar Council. If it is architecture, by the Council of Architecture. If it is agriculture, by the Indian Council of Agriculture Research. So all these regulatory bodies must ensure that, irrespective of the character of that institution, whether they are directly funded by them, or whether they're aided institutions, or whether they are institutions purely privately managed, must ensure that the general academic norms, the administrative norms, the financial norms, all these are followed as per laid down rules and regulations, and as per the statutes and guidelines and notifications that come out from time to time. They cannot deviate from that. They have to operate within that framework. And also for quality assurance, that they will go in for accreditation. Of course, we haven't made it mandatory so far, and that is why the whole accreditation reforms are based on that, because very few of these institutions go in for NAC accreditation and go in for NIRF ranking systems, and they sort of don't look at quality assurance. But we have said that these institutions must be urged to come forward, to come into the accreditation and quality assurance norms. So this would be one way of looking at how governance reforms uniformly apply to all categories of higher education institutions, irrespective of their character, in terms of being a centrally funded institution or a state government funded institution, or being an aided college, or being a completely private university. So these norms remain the same. They also talked in terms of certain instrumentalities in the policy. So one, we said that one of the strong points of governance is to have an apex level governing body over and above what is already there, which we would have loved to call as the empowered board of governors. Now, this empowered board of governors can be a replacement of your existing board of management, or the executive committee, or your board of governors. It can be a substitution of that. What is important is that this is a collegiate body, and it is representative of a very democratically chosen body, made by their institution itself, not by the government and not by an external body. And we said that this applies even to centrally funded institutions, which is where we don't want I mean, you can have a government representative, but the representation should be from the leadership, from the management of that own institution, should be from the civil society, must be having representatives of the scientific community, must have faculty representatives, student representatives, parents representatives. You can have retired educationists and academicians. We wanted it to be a broad, it wanted it to be a collegiate body wherein multiple stakeholders who have a very large world view of education come into the picture, along with, of course, all those categories which have to be represented from the SCDGs, meaning the SCs, the STs, women. Their representation should also be there. So in a certain sense, the policy talked about this empowered board of governors as a collegiate body created by the institution itself with very minimal external interference, whether you call it governmental interference, whether you call it in a private institution, the family interference, or the interference of a trust or a society and their influence, or if it is a state government, from the state government side, but have representatives from all these cross sections who are stakeholders in the business of education. So industry being there, scientific community being there, the student parent representatives, the faculty representative, the leaderships of their own institution. That way you make it as a very comprehensive body which looks at skills part of it, which looks at research, which looks at innovation, which looks at emerging trends that are happening, including people from technology, so ICT based edtech people that need to come, people from finance, because education loans and all these are things that come in from banking sectors. So this kind of a representative body may be created. Now, some are in the process of creating it. Some are including in that existing body people from these, and this is to be done on a rotational basis with maybe 2 years or 3 years, whatever that institution feels right. The second instrumentality that we talked about was in terms of looking at preparing a strategic plan of action, and that you are all can go back and visit your own institution's websites, and we will read a vision statement, a mission statement, and the goals and objectives. Now, in the context of the national education policy having come forward with a very different perspective, in looking at multidisciplinarity, looking at more focus on research and innovation, looking on emphasis on language and technology, all these call for revisiting our vision and mission statements. And for doing all that, we said that let each institution prepare what we call an institutional development plan. So that is nothing but a strategic plan of action where we would like each institution, again over here also, this document is not to be prepared by someone external. It is not to be outsourced to some agency, or it is not to be contracted to, subcontracted to someone else. It is the institution itself in terms of faculty, deans, directors, senior management, student representatives, parent community, civil society coming in together. Internally, first, you can have a small task force where external members may not be there. And you may have some 2 or 3 advisors, if possible, who are like planners and so on. But these small task force, which includes the management, the faculty, the student representatives, some 1 or 2 parents, then these advisors, a couple of retired educationists coming together, they prepare a IDP, which is nothing but a document which envisages where you would like to see your institution going forward in 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 7 years from now. You can put it up to 10 to 15 years from now. So if you're doing it now up to 2040, what we are looking at how my college or my university should be going forward, and you create a kind of a roadmap where firstly you have to do a SWOT analysis where you assess your own institution's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats or challenges. So a SWOT or a SWOC analysis. This helps you to understand, are faculty in position? Is physical infrastructure there? Is ICT infrastructure available? Are we lacking in teaching learning resources like libraries and other reading resources? Are we having issues relating to capacity building? Is there a problem of student numbers? Is there a very skewed student faculty ratio? Should faculty positions be filled in the context of multidisciplinarity? Are we thinking in terms of collaboration? So looking at a SWOT analysis, you need to revisit your own institution's vision, mission, and objectives, and then identify key performance indicators with timelines and funding so that you chart out something that can go on up to 15 years or so. Now, this document is not a one-time exercise. And after the initial task force prepares it, I told you that it should have other stakeholders, and therefore it needs to go in for a kind of getting in the views on that document by people who may be a retired scientist or an educationist or a person from industry or from the civil society, giving their views, the community also coming in, and then incorporating all that and then putting it in the public domain in a draft form for inviting views and suggestions. Because a higher education institution in its function is of teaching, research, and social engagement or community engagement is not there as an isolated unit, but is connected to the community around it. And therefore, there you must invite views of people on that document before you firm it up. And once it is firmed up, because you need to get in people from your finance section, you need to get in people from your administration, because you're putting timelines. So if it is infrastructure development, if it is in terms of looking at training that you're looking at, what is the cost that would be involved? So there is a lot of timelines and financing. Therefore, the involvement of many functionaries within the institution becomes very important, and there must be a nodal officer who will be in charge of ensuring that there is effective coordination among all the internal units involved while preparing the IDP. And once it is done and the IDP is firmed up and finalized, it is not to be kept in the shelves of a library or forgotten altogether as an archival material. It's a living document which has to be monitored and which has to be looked at as a ready reckoner. Where are we? Have we achieved it? So you will have an annual plan. And in that annual plan, let us say coming from 24-25, you put some targets that currently we are not participating in NAC accreditation. One of the performance indicators is to get accredited, and that therefore you will go in for NAC. Have we got it? Have we done it? If you're already accredited, this was your score, you want to go in for a higher score. And that these kind of things must be, every minute detail has to be sort of, and UGC has brought out guidelines on how to prepare an IDP. So have a look at it and don't say, I am only an assistant professor or I am only an associate professor and I really don't have any role in these kind of things. In aspects related to governance and management, each one of us is a stakeholder, and therefore you must all feel an integral part of being an owner within that. You should own your own institution. The need to feel that sense of belonging to your institution is very important, so that each one of us feels committed to achieving the goals of our institution. And it's not just, I am a sociology professor, I'm just going there to teach sociology. In what way am I connected with any of these? Not at all. We are all part of that collegiate decision making, and our voices have to be heard, and you need to make your voices heard. So you have to be more proactive. You need to start looking at how you take forward this message. Say, for example, if you have not heard about given to the dean or the director to whom you report, you need to make them aware that, yes, this is what the NEP is talking about. This is what we were told in our sensitization program, and we should start looking at preparing an IDP. So an IDP doesn't come from an institution at the first instance. Every department starts making it, and then the whole thing is put together at an institutional level. And there you have you will have contradictions that come about which needs to be erased. And it's a very iterative exercise. You keep doing it again and again and again till you refine it to give it a broad shape. And it is, as I said, a living document which helps you to monitor the growth strategy of your own institution. And you keep making mid-course corrections and as you go along. So you set certain goals, you have worked out on certain strategies to reach that goals. These goals have to be achieved in a certain time frame, and this is the fund that is available to you. And you have for every annual plan an exercise that is being done, which will then escalate and sort of get aggregated together as you go along. And you can take a stock. Okay, there is a monitoring committee which takes a review of it every 6 months maybe. And you also have a kind of a mechanism where you take a complete review of it by a higher level committee if you want. And this exercise should be an ongoing exercise, so that finally you are trying to say, yes, we achieved higher enrollment, we ensured that we achieved goals of equity, we had so many number of SCs, OBCs, minorities, and so on, how many differently abled and learning disability students. This was the achievement levels our students got placed, they did research. All these targets, all these independent goals or targets, which are very, very tangible by nature. You didn't have teachers started getting appointed, you didn't have incubation centers, you did not have library books, you did not have computers, all of it. See, this is a complete exercise which will in a certain sense address many of the requirements, which is looking at the goals of access, equity, quality, affordability, and accountability. It actually, an IDP is a complete exercise internally done by the institution. That is where your sense of belonging comes in, and being a part of that exercise itself would make you all much more into understanding how you plan and strategize on achieving certain identified goals. Now, this IDP, along with your empowered board of governors, are two major instrumentalities that will make governance very robust. But at the same time, before I jump into the topic of regulation, I'd only like to talk 2 or 3 words about leadership. And the assumption that leadership or academic leadership comes in only as we go into positions of becoming a professor is something that we should remove from our mind. We look at leadership in academic leadership development in 3 levels. For the early beginner at the level of an assistant professor, at a mid level, and also at a senior level that we are talking of vice chancellors and directors and deans of institutions and so on. Now, in each of these levels, be they at whatever level they are, certain qualities must be there within all of it. And we are talking in terms of some 8 or 9 or 10 such qualities, where we are talking that a good leader would have abilities to have visioning and strategizing, will have abilities of people management skills. People management is very, very important because, as I said, HEIs are very complex enterprises. We have students, we have faculty, representative of various cross sections, administrative staff, senior management. So handling people, handling all categories of people in a very congenial manner, in a very cooperative spirit, becomes very important. So people management skills. And then coming to the whole idea in terms of conflict resolution and decision making. And you have areas of strain that happens because of discord. Maybe the timetable is not in order. Maybe the kind of rules and regulations for punctuality and division of work among the staff. Various reasons why students and teachers can have conflict, or faculty among themselves can have, or faculty with the senior management can have. So conflict resolution and decision making. Then looking at the quality of teaching and learning, because that's what we are in the business of in a college or a university. How to enhance the quality of teaching and learning. looking at technology. How do we use technology in a very effective manner so as to be more qualitative, so as to reach out to larger numbers, so as to ensure that we use multiple models of teaching and move towards more advanced technologies so that our students are nowhere lacking when you're talking about disruptive technologies and of artificial intelligence and so on. So how do we do that? And therefore, in that comes open and distance learning and so on. How do we integrate skills as part of education? And the whole idea, therefore, of the importance of looking at education, not just in the spectrum like this. It is skills, education, research, and innovation. So this comes together in one part as one of the important qualities that a leader has, and to look at this particular spectrum. Then addressing student support and student grievances. So when I talk about even student grievances, diversity of our students, and therefore discrimination that comes about, and discrimination that comes by caste, by community, by language, by gender, and the kind of grievances that can come from there have all to be addressed, including the learning support that we need to provide in terms of academic counseling, career counseling, psychological counseling, and socio-emotional well-being of the students. And then coming to this whole spectrum in terms of financial management and administrative management, which are the rules and regulations. And we cannot, I hear a number of times faculty saying that, see, I don't know how to fill a bill because I'm teaching a subject, I have no idea. I mean, what do you mean? In your own house, if you're running a house, you know that you got to give some money to buy milk, or you have some monthly account where you keep for the fees of the child, for the maid that comes in, for the savings that you do. So I fail to understand when a faculty says that, no, this is not something that I'm familiar with. I mean, it's not rocket science to say that you need to know the rules of administration or the rules of finance. And therefore, you must be very aware of it. So when you want to do projects, for example, you need to know when I'm getting funding for a project, whether it is the fund that goes in for the payment to the project staff, what is the fund that goes in for the actual surveys and the data collection that we look at. So one cannot ignore that even as faculty, that we cannot be aware of what rules and regulations are there, both in the administrative space and in the financial norms and regulations. So that part of administrative management and financial management. And last but not the least, because we are looking at higher education from the point of view of internationalization. And therefore, a leader should be very, very conscious of opportunities for student exchanges, faculty exchanges, collaborative research, joint degrees, twinning programs, dual degrees, all those possibilities that come into the way of cross-border higher education. So this is a spectrum that we should have in our mind, and not say that, you know, in no way am I connected to it. And as I said, at a level of an assistant professor, at a beginner level, as a mid-level functionary, and as a senior management level functionary, you need to be conscious at the level that you are also a leader in the making. And therefore, you must also nurture those kind of qualities and look at these perspectives from these 8 or 10 that I have listed out as being very important, that makes you an able leader as you go along. Because we have in the policy very clearly said, in the career progression for the faculty and as part of the professional development and capacity building, that it is faculty who should be allowed to take up academic leadership roles. It should not be a bureaucrat, it should not be an industrialist, it should not be some we who need to move on to take up leadership positions. And that is not something that you can acquire overnight. And therefore, you must have a very gradual way in which you actually develop your leadership qualities, so that as you take on the new roles and the new mantles, you are not there like a fish out of water. You may have a lot of people to advise you, but you also should be very well equipped yourself to take on these roles as you go along. Which brings me now to the last part of my section, and that is on the regulation. So we had been very conscious in the policy that ours is a higher education system which is very over-regulated. One, in terms of the regulatory bodies, as I said, we have 17 professional regulatory bodies, the UGC, which takes care of the bulk of our institutions. Then you have the AICT for the technical management and pharmacy, and not pharmacy, it looks at hotel management and hospitality sector and so on. And then you have the National Council for Teacher Education, which looks at B.Ed and pre-service teacher education, Bar Council, which looks at legal education, the National Medical Commission, which looks at medical education, the Agricultural Council, the Nursing Council, the Council of Architecture, the Pharmacy Council, and so on. Like that, we have 17 such councils which take care of various streams of education and their professional practice. So the registration on completing your engineering or your medical education is taken care of by these bodies, which give you the power to practice the profession that you have earned your degree in. Now, bulk of us understand that there are 4 functions that come into the whole spectrum of regulation. One is to regulate a higher education institution, that it is following standard norms, academic norms, administrative norms, financial norms, and so on. So that is regulating it. Then it is funding. Then it is academic standard setting. And then it is a quality assurance or accreditation. So the functions are regulation, funding, standard setting, and accreditation. Strangely, these 4 functions are not necessarily mutually inclusive. There are some functions which stand in contradiction to one another. And they are ideally, like what we say in a democracy, that the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary should never be in one body, and there should be separation of powers. We have seen that when we said that the higher education space is overregulated, particularly in the context of UGC, AICT, and so on, we know that it combines within itself all these 4 functions, where these 4 functions of regulation, funding, standard setting, and accreditation should be separate. Instead of being in separate bodies, it is the same body which looks after all these functions. This has 2 major stumbling blocks. One, it is an over-concentration of power in a single body. And 2, because I said that these functions are not mutually inclusive, and therefore there are contradictions which can be counterproductive, because there is 2 bodies within the same regulatory structure which are not seeing eye to eye, and which is therefore impacting the higher education institutions in the way they need to get their approvals, and therefore there are long delays that happen, and so on. A very high degree of bureaucratization that comes in because of that. So the need to have the separation of powers in the functions of regulation, funding, accreditation, and standard setting was the basic principle on which we talked about a complete overhauling of the regulatory system. And we said that these regulatory bodies must look at this new architecture that we are talking of, where there is a separate body for regulation, separate body for funding, separate body for standard setting, and a separate body for accreditation. So we said that we will create a National Higher Education Regulatory Council, which will take care of regulation of all higher education institutions and not divide it between Bar Council, the National Medical Commission, the Council of Architecture, and so on, because we have said on one side, all education is going to become multidisciplinary. So you don't expect, if your institution is becoming multidisciplinary, you're offering law courses, that you have to run to Bar Council to get approval for it. You are offering pharmacy courses, you have to run to pharmacy. You cannot have a multiplicity of bodies to which a higher education institution should be. So all regulatory powers of these councils will come into the National Higher Regulatory Council. Then we said that moment we are disbanding the existing structure, UGC, AICT, NCT, these bodies become null and void, and they will concede their regulatory powers to this new architecture. So for funding, since many of the higher education institutions which are non-technical and even technical ones, they are getting their funding from, since AICT will become like a standard setting body and NCT will become like a standard setting body, we must have a funding agency for higher education, and therefore the Higher Education Grants Council HEGC, we said would be the higher education funding body. Then we said that for accreditation, the existing NAAC and the NBA will become like parts of a super accreditor, whom we call would be the National Assessment Council, which will subsume the NAC and the NBA, and will have multiple number of accrediting agencies. And we also said in accreditation that the present system of accrediting, nowhere in the world is accreditation done on a rating scale of 5 or 7, and therefore that everywhere in the world it is binary accreditation. Either a college is accredited or not accredited. Beyond that, you don't say anything. So that is how the new accreditation guidelines have come, which are getting implemented right now as we speak, that either a college is accredited or it is not accredited. If there are colleges which are not accredited, they are given a kind of a waiting period where they can take some time to go in for accreditation. So there is a third category, awaiting accreditation kind of a thing. Institutions which are already accredited and have followed a A++ and so on, they can continue to sort of look at a rating score so that their grading can still get improved, but it is not mandatory that all institutions go into that kind of rating. It is only a binary accreditation. Gradually, we will do away with that rating to say an institution is accredited or not accredited. And that will ensure that currently only 1/10 of the higher education institutions go in for accreditation, because they're very much scared about making this self-study report and having a NAC inspection team come there, and less said about an inspection team, the better it is. That whole exercise has prevented many institutions from going in for that. Rather, we would rather say that all higher education institutions should be encouraged to go in, and that's why we are moving to this reform, which is the global practice of going in for binary accreditation. So the third body is the National Assessment or the National Accreditation Council, which will take care of this whole exercise of accrediting higher education institutions. Now, since the existing bodies get disbanded, we are converting AICTE, NCTE, and all of them to become professional standard setting bodies, which will lay down both the academic standards and the professional standards. And since UGC was looking at the academic standard setting, and UGC as an act would become null and void, we said that we can create a general education council for all such areas which are not taken care of by the other professional standard setting bodies. And therefore, the new body that would be created would be a general education council. AICT will become a standard setting body. NCT will become a standard setting body. All pharmacy council, nursing council, agriculture council, all of them will become standard setting bodies. So the new architecture is the NHERC for regulation, the HEGC for funding, the National Accreditation Council for accreditation, and the professional standard setting bodies, including the GEC, for looking at academic standard setting. Now, one question that came before us, and this is where there is a blatant distinction between what we wrote in the committee's report and what came out in the policy, is that we were asked in our feedback to the public domain, then we put the report, that if these bodies start fighting amongst each other, then the whole system of regulation might fall. And that is why we talked about an umbrella body that we call is the Higher Education Commission of India. So that is the Higher Education HECI bill, which has to be tabled in the parliament. It was already told by the Honorable Finance Minister in 2 of her budget speeches. Now that it is the same suspension back again, we are hoping that the HECI bill will get tabled to become an act. The moment it becomes an act, the UGC and the AICT and all such bodies get disbanded. Their acts become null and void, and they concede their powers to the new structures that are to be created. Now, in this whole exercise, we had opposition from 2 bodies, which said that they had recently restructured their regulatory councils, and that is the Bar Council and the National Medical Commission. So in the initial part, they were not very willing to concede their regulatory powers. It does not mean that they do not agree to multidisciplinarity, that they allow, but they may not be a part of the HECI architecture in the initial years, but they are subject to joining us at a later stage. And now that we took so many years to actually bring that bill into making it an act, it is possible by now there has been a lot of rethinking on their part. So the new regulatory architecture has certain fundamental principles. One is the separation of powers, resulting in not having concentration of powers, preventing conflicts by having a umbrella architecture of the HECI, which was being an overarching body. The idea that more accrediting institutions, more institutions going for binary accreditation, that you have a clear understanding of academic standard setting and professional standard setting, and you also have a more, I would say, a more slimmer version for funding, because that body is taking care only of funding. So when you separate, the functions also get reduced, and therefore the greater focus, and rather than 3 years after a budget is passed not getting funds, or an annual budget fund coming to us almost in the month of January when the financial year is coming to March, these delays may completely go away. And also we have said that we should use technology in terms of the management information systems, and we are also talking about one nation, one data, so that an institution is not being asked to repeat the same exercise, submitting data for All India survey, then submitting data for NAC accreditation, submitting data for NIRF ranking, and so many other things. So one nation, one data should streamline that. So using technology and putting things in public domain through public disclosure, and a system of internal checks and balances rather than inspections and inspecting team coming and so on, where there is a element of feeling that some things are not sometimes fair, and therefore it would do away with many unfair practices which we see in these kind of exercises of an inspection team coming and so on. So this whole so the structure as well as a lot of reforms that we are envisaging look at actually ensuring that the system is not over-regulated. It is, as what I said, a light but tight regulation, ensuring public probity, ensuring that public accountability is there, ensuring minimal use of human interference by using technology, and ensuring that there is less possibilities of unfair practices, while ensuring a very streamlined and a rationalized system of governance and management. I think I've given you a spectrum of this, and I think I'll stop over here and keep the remaining 10 minutes or so for interaction. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Participants,
you,
if you
ma'am.
have
Thank you.
any question, you can ask.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, how is the NEP acceptance in other states, ma'am? Because so NEP, SEP, there is always a drama between the state and center. But the acceptance in other states, how good it is, ma'am?
As a policy maker, let me first tell you that politics and policies must never be mixed together. But in a country like ours, which is so vast and where the subject of education is in the concurrent list, it is usually sometimes very difficult to keep them at, I would say, objective distances. And therefore, there is a lot of subjectivity that comes in. Now, having said that, the policy making exercise, we were quite conscious of bringing about a lot of consensus by taking states on board. I don't have the time to go into that exercise, but it has been one of the most participative exercises where right from the villages to the taluks, to the blocks, to the district, to the state, and at the national level, we had consultations. Now, having the policy having been formally approved, because you mixed politics and therefore you looked at the character of the government in the center and the state, if they were aligned, that we follow it, and we do not follow it if we are not aligned. Now there is a growing realization that each state would try and sort of do these reforms, because ultimately the stakeholder is the student. So say, for example, when I say I offer a 3-year, 4-year undergraduate program, and I say that there is an exit option in the first year, and then the student goes and does the second year in another institution, in another state, if that student is not going to get that benefit, then it is very likely to create a lot of confusion. And so wisdom has prevailed, and irrespective of the character of government, they are doing these reforms without wanting to call it the national education policy. Fair enough for us. I mean, I am not really worried if people called it a state policy or people called it something else, as long as we follow the basic principles of multidisciplinarity, we accept that, the kind of regulatory reforms, we put more emphasis on research and innovation, we look at giving encouragement to open and distance learning, we look at the importance of languages, introduce technology, introduce all the disruptive technologies. But yes, I would say as of now, except for Tamil Nadu, which has openly said that they will come out with their own policy, which is fair enough, and we have no reason to feel any sense of grouse about that, that they almost all of them are embracing the reforms. And even Tamil Nadu, for that matter, I have taken at my own level as many as 20 workshops at an individual level, where I've covered a number of institutions in Tamil Nadu, and they are all in the process of implementing these very reforms of multidisciplinarity, emphasis on research and innovation, use of technology. All this is being done even there. They may call it by some other nomenclature. So be it. Even in the school education, we wrote that we will have national level curriculum for school education, teacher education, adult education, early childhood care and education. Even Kerala government went about bringing out their own curriculum framework, which is more or less, I would say, about 70% of them aligned to the national curriculum framework. So there is really no reason for us to feel alarmed about it, because every state in its final aspirational goal would like to provide good quality inclusive education, and therefore, since that is the overarching goal, I do not think, even though there may be different shades of government at the center and the state, that should not really be a factor that comes in the way of implementing education reforms.
Because as far as the 2020, some of the
You're not audible. Your voice is
मोहन जी
cracking.
आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही है. Any other participants? ओपी सिंह कुछ पूछना चाहता हूँ. ओपी सिंह सर.
No, thanks a lot, sir.
hear me now, ma'am?
मोहन कुमार जी आपकी आवाज क्लियर नहीं आ रही है. No, not at all. अभी भी नहीं आपकी आ रही है आवाज.
Type your question in the chat box. Maybe then
Yes.
Dr. Aftab can read it. No, you're not audible. Your voice is cracking up. Any other participant? Meanwhile, any other participant? Regarding employment opportunities. Okay.
Regarding employment opportunities.
Okay. Now, you are saying to what extent the multidisciplinary approach might help. No, some courses. No, don't worry about some courses not being taken. Let me ask you a question. Those students who passed, let us assume even that they did BSc chemistry, they did not take up jobs because they learned chemistry or physics. They take up jobs which are somewhat not at all connected to their area of study. And that is what we are trying to rectify. So the current system, there is a complete de-link between the degrees and the kind of jobs. As I told you, if engineers are doing work as clerks, or if you find that science graduates are working in a bank, or they are working in a financial firm, or they are working in a hotel, it is not what they did. So that disconnect or the de-link between the degrees and the jobs is very much there now. And in the future, we see a complete obliteration, because job profiles do not really look at one specific specialization. Job profiles describe a variety of skills that students need to have. Therefore, the fear that we are having that because it is multidisciplinary, exact job profiles will not be there. On the contrary, The job profiles require multidisciplinarity, and that is what we are trying to align ourselves with. But just because someone did not learn a subject, because that is a discipline you are teaching, and your fear that you may be as a teacher becoming redundant is in your college, maybe it was not there, but it is only a question of transition. And even if it is not the core chemistry, you should be able to take up value-added courses or skill enhancement courses which deal with chemistry, or including minor courses which deal with chemistry. So you must look at curriculum planning in a manner by which, even if the core it is not taken as a core major, there are avenues by which you can look at your discipline in terms of a minor interdisciplinary, or in terms of a value-added course, or in terms of a skill enhancement course. So you need to scout for looking out for courses in which the use of chemistry comes in for a skill-based course, or in terms of, let us say for example, understanding chemistry from the point of view of pesticides and fertilizers, which is a requirement of agribusiness requirement today, or looking at preservation and food technology. So that kind of new scope that the discipline offers, you as faculty in that discipline must start exploring, so that you can incorporate that into curriculum planning, because students are not traditionally interested in the core disciplines, because they find that learning it is not really making them a chemist or a physicist kind of a thing. And as long as the dealing remains and they are not really researchers by nature, they only want a degree, we must do a lot of relook at our curriculum planning to mix up this curricula in a manner which is packaged in a different way and has greater marketability among the students.
Any other
Thank you, ma'am.
participants?
Thank you.
Thank you, Krishnan sir. I think, ma'am, there is no question more.
Okay.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your nice deliberation on the topic. On behalf of HRDC, I would like to thank you again for this discussion with the participants of this program. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, and all of you stay blessed and be open to ideas, and start relooking at the roles that we perform, and you will find teaching as being a very fulfilling career, and I'm sure you'll all do well in your future
Good.
lives. Thank you very
Thank
much. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
ma'am.
ma'am.
So much, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Join for next lecture on the next link, which has been provided already to you.